The call came just after 6:30 a.m., the hour when the building was quiet enough that every sound felt amplified. I hadn't even taken my coat off yet when my phone vibrated across the metal desk. The caller ID already telling me where I was being summoned. Assistant Director Patterson never called agents directly unless a case had already crossed an invisible line. His office at the Cleveland field office smelled faintly of burnt coffee and old paper. He didn't offer me a seat right away. Instead, he slid a thin manila folder across the desk, the kind used when someone wants to pretend a problem is small. 3 clipped incident reports sat inside. Missing persons, Milbrook, Ohio. 3 families, Patterson said. All at once. I scanned the names. Johnson, Williams, Hartman. 15 people total. Parents, children, grandparents. No ransom notes. No signs of forced entry. No abandoned vehicles. They hadn't vanished gradually. They'd simply stopped being present. What's the problem? I asked. We handle mass disappearances all the time. Patterson exhaled slowly, like he was bracing himself. Local police confirmed the missing persons reports. Then they withdrew them. 2 days later. They told Cincinnati there was no case. Now the sheriff claims those families never lived there. I looked back down at the pages. The revisions were clean. No red flags. No signs of panic. It was as if someone had calmly erased 15 people from existence and expected the paperwork to agree. You're sending me because you think they're lying, I said. Patterson shook his head. No, I'm sending you because I don't think they are. That was when the unease set in. Not fear yet, just a quiet pressure behind my eyes. The sense that this wasn't a hunt for missing people, but for something else entirely. As I left his office, folder tucked under my arm, I had the irrational thought that Milbrook wasn't hiding a crime. It was correcting a mistake. The drive to Milbrook took a little over 3 hours. Long enough for the case file to start feeling unreal in my hands. Missing families don't usually stay abstract for long. There's always a moment when panic leaks through the paperwork, an unreturned call, a neighbor who noticed something wrong too late. Milbrook's file had none of that. The reports were sterile, controlled, almost polite. I stopped at a rest area 20 miles outside town and called the Milbrook Police Department. The desk officer who answered sounded relaxed, even cheerful, when I identified myself and asked to confirm the missing persons case numbers. There was a pause, just long enough to register as confusion, not alarm. Ma'am, we don't have any open missing persons cases, he said. I read the names aloud. Johnson, Lambert, Hartman. Another pause, then a soft laugh. Like I'd made a mistake he didn't want to embarrass me over. Those families don't live here. I asked if they ever had. No, he said, confidently, not that I'm aware of. I hung up and tried the county records office. Same answer. I pulled over again and checked the timestamps. The original reports were real, filed, signed, verified, and then quietly undone, as if the town had collectively decided to forget. When I crossed into Milbrook, the welcome sign greeted me with a painted smile, a town where everyone belongs. The streets were busy, kids on bikes, couples walking dogs. No boarded windows, no for sale signs, no indication that 15 people had disappeared without a ripple. I stopped at a gas station and asked the cashier how long she'd lived there. All my life, she said. I asked if she knew the Johnsons. Her brow furrowed, not in fear, but in honest confusion. Sorry, she said. I don't know anyone by that name. That was the moment it clicked. Not intellectually, emotionally. Loss wasn't being hidden here. It was being rejected. As if absence itself was an error Milbrook refused to acknowledge. I got back in my car, with the unsettling sense that I was the only person carrying something that didn't belong, and that the town would do whatever it took to correct that imbalance. I checked into the only motel in Milbrook just before dusk. The clerk smiled too quickly when I handed over my ID, like he'd rehearsed the gesture. He didn't glance at my badge, didn't ask why an FBI agent needed a room in a town with no crime worth mentioning. He slid the key across the counter and wished me a pleasant stay, the words landing with strange emphasis, as if pleasant were an obligation rather than a hope. In the room, I laid the case file out across the bed and began rebuilding the timeline from scratch. Original missing persons calls placed within minutes of each other, statements taken, addresses confirmed. Then, silence. Retractions filed with no explanation. Follow-up reports stating the families were located without saying where. The final note read, "No further action required." That sentence bothered me more than anything else. Not case closed, not error corrected, no further action required. As if the system itself had been satisfied. I went back out after dark and drove the neighborhoods listed in the reports. The houses were occupied, lights on, televisions flickering behind curtains. At the Johnson address, a pickup truck sat in the driveway, the same make and model noted in the original file. Wind chimes hung from the porch. Someone had taken care to keep everything consistent. I parked across the street and watched. After a few minutes, a man stepped out onto the porch. He was about the right height, the right build, even from a distance. Something about him felt familiar in a way that made my skin prickle. He stood there for a long moment, scanning the quiet street. And for an instant, I had the irrational impression that he was looking directly at me, despite the darkness. Then he went back inside, and the porch light clicked off. I wrote my notes by hand that night, something I hadn't done in years. Digital records felt wrong here, too easy to revise. As I closed the notebook, a thought surfaced uninvited, cold and precise. This town isn't hiding what happened to those families. It replaced them. That was the first omen. Not proof, not evidence, just a fracture in certainty. But once it appeared, I couldn't unsee it, and I understood that whatever Milbrook was, it had already noticed me. Morning light transformed Milbrook into something out of a brochure. The fog burned off quickly, revealing neat rows of houses, trimmed hedges, and sidewalks without a single crack. It was the kind of town designed to reassure you before you even parked the car. I drove slowly, not because of traffic, but because my instincts told me to look closer. Everything was in motion. Yet nothing felt spontaneous. People waved at each other with practiced familiarity. Conversations ended at crosswalks with the same timing, like cues being followed. I parked near the town square and stepped out. The air smelled faintly of cut grass and fresh coffee. A banner stretched between two lampposts announced a community fundraiser scheduled for the weekend. The date was circled on a chalkboard outside a cafe, written in careful, looping handwriting. This was not a town in shock. This was not a town recovering from loss. As I walked, I noticed how often people met my eyes, and how quickly they looked away once they registered I was a stranger. Not suspicious, curious, but contained. No one asked who I was or why I was there. It was as if the town had decided I was expected, even if no one knew my name. I passed the hardware store, the diner, the insurance office. Each business was open, staffed, operating smoothly. According to my file, all three should have been closed 2 weeks ago. Instead, they looked like they'd never missed a day. There were no temporarily closed signs, no grieving notices taped to doors. Life hadn't paused here. It had continued without friction. What unsettled me most was the absence of gaps. In towns where something bad has happened, You can feel it in the empty spaces, in the houses no one occupies, the routines no one resumes. Milbrook had no empty spaces. Every role was filled, every place accounted for. By the time I reached the sheriff's office, a quiet certainty had taken hold. Whatever had happened to the missing families hadn't disrupted this town. Milbrook hadn't absorbed the loss. It had adjusted for it. Sheriff Daniel Collins' office sat at the edge of the town square, its brick exterior freshly painted, the flag out front hanging perfectly still, despite the breeze I felt on my face. Inside, everything smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old wood. The walls were lined with commendations, community photos, smiling faces frozen in moments of civic pride. Nothing about the place suggested disorder. Collins rose from behind his desk when I entered. He was polite, solidly built, the kind of man who looked like he'd shaken every hand in town at least once. His smile came easily, without calculation. When I introduced myself and explained why I was there, I watched his expression carefully, waiting for the flicker of recognition or panic. It never came. "Missing families?" he repeated, brow creasing slightly, not defensively, genuinely puzzled. He leaned back in his chair and folded his hands, thinking. "I'm sorry, Agent Martinez, I don't have any cases like that." I slid copies of the reports across his desk. He studied them with interest, nodding slowly as if reading about a place he'd never visited. He pointed out procedural details, complimented the thoroughness of the initial response, then stopped at the names. "These people don't live here," he said. Not firmly, not dismissively, just matter of fact. I asked him if he was sure. He chuckled softly. "I'd remember losing 15 people. This isn't a big town." I pressed harder, listing addresses, businesses, family histories. Each time. Collins listened attentively, then shook his head with the same mild concern, like a doctor correcting a patient's misunderstanding. "I think there's been some kind of clerical mix-up," he said. "Or maybe the report was meant for another Milbrook. It happens." What disturbed me wasn't his refusal to acknowledge the case. It was the absence of motive. He wasn't protecting anyone. He wasn't afraid. He truly believed what he was saying. When I asked if the names meant anything to him at all, he paused longer than before. His eyes drifted to the window, unfocused, as if searching his memory for something that wasn't there. "No," he said finally, "they don't," as I stood to leave. He smiled again and added, "If you need anything while you're in town, just ask. We take care of our own here." The phrase lingered with me as I stepped back outside, because I wasn't sure anymore who our own referred to, or whether I was included. The Johnson house sat on a quiet residential street, its white siding clean, its lawn trimmed with almost obsessive care. Wind chimes hung from the porch, chiming softly in the afternoon breeze. According to the report, this was where the disappearance began. According to Milbrook, nothing had ever happened here at all. I rang the doorbell and waited, already rehearsing the questions in my head. Footsteps approached from inside, unhurried, confident. The door opened, and for a brief, disorienting moment, I thought I was looking at a photograph. The man in front of me was Robert Johnson. Same height, same build, same narrow nose and slightly uneven eyes. Even the faint scar near his left eyebrow matched the DMV photo in my file. My brain stalled, trying to reconcile the impossible with what it was seeing. Then he smiled and said, "Can I help you?" I introduced myself. He listened politely, nodding along, until I mentioned the Johnson family. His expression shifted, not to fear or anger, but to mild embarrassment, like I'd confused him with someone else. "I think you've got the wrong house," he said. "My name's Robert Thompson." I asked how long he'd lived there. 15 years, he replied without hesitation. He owned Thompson Hardware downtown. I'd just driven past it an hour earlier. Inside, the house was lived in but impersonal. Family photos lined the hallway. The faces in them were unfamiliar, except for his. He appeared in every frame, younger or older, always the same man, different names written on the backs. I asked if he'd ever heard of Robert Johnson. He laughed softly. "No, ma'am, sorry." As I stepped back onto the porch, something caught my eye. A package by the door, addressed to R. Thompson. The handwriting matched the utility bills in my file for R. Johnson. Same looping letters, same pressure marks. I stood there longer than necessary, staring at the house, the man, the name that didn't fit the face. This wasn't identity theft. It was identity substitution. And the most unsettling part wasn't that Robert Johnson was gone. It was that someone, or something, had stepped into his life so perfectly that the absence no longer existed. Downtown Milbrook consisted of a single, tidy strip of storefronts arranged around the square like pieces on a board. I walked it slowly, stopping in front of Thompson Hardware. The sign was new, the paint unchipped, the letters evenly spaced. According to every record I had, that sign should have read Johnson Hardware. The business license in the county database had been amended 2 weeks ago. The change logged without comment. Inside, nothing was out of place. The aisles were stocked exactly as listed in Johnson's old inventory reports. Same brands, same quantities. Even the seasonal end cap displayed the same discounted snow shovels I'd seen mentioned in a supplier invoice from the previous winter. It was as if the store had never noticed its own transformation. Robert Thompson stood behind the counter, greeting customers by name. He moved through the space with the unconscious confidence of someone who belonged there. When I asked about the store's history, he gave me a practiced summary. 15 years in business, family-owned, proud to serve the community. The words flowed easily, like a script he'd rehearsed until it felt like memory. I left and crossed the street to the diner. Peterson's Family Diner. The sign read, "Inside." The menu matched the one attached to the Williams family's tax filings down to the last typo. The smell of grease and coffee hung in the air. The man at the grill looked up, and my stomach tightened. It was him again. The same face. David Peterson smiled and wiped his hands on a towel. He told me he'd been flipping burgers there since his 20s. He pointed out the booth where his kids liked to sit after school. The details were convincing. The emotion felt real. By the time I reached Mitchell and Associates, I stopped pretending coincidence was still an option. Different names, different professions, identical faces, identical confidence, identical histories, built to fill the same empty spaces. These businesses shouldn't have existed, yet they were thriving, precise replacements for something Milbrook had decided it no longer needed by the third stop. The shock had dulled into something colder. I stopped reacting and started cataloging. Names, addresses, professions. Each replacement slid perfectly into the life it had inherited, like a hand into a glove already warmed by someone else's skin. There were no seams showing, no hesitation when they spoke about their pasts, no awareness that those pasts had been written over something else. I visited homes listed in the original reports, one after another. Each door was answered by the same face wearing a different expression, a different posture, a different name. A school teacher who swore she'd grown up in Milbrook her entire life. A realtor who insisted he'd sold half the houses on his street. A volunteer EMT who spoke proudly about responding to fires that official logs credited to men who no longer existed. Every story was supported by documents, photos, neighbors who nodded in agreement. It wasn't just the missing families who had been replaced. It was the context around them. The town had rebalanced itself, redistributing memory so smoothly that there was no friction left to feel. I tested the boundaries. I mentioned old events pulled from the erased families' histories, little league games, church fundraisers, high school graduations. The responses came back altered, but intact. Same events, different names, different children holding the trophies. The past itself had been edited to accommodate the present. What frightened me most was how naturally everyone participated. No one hesitated before correcting me. No one showed discomfort when the details shifted. The truth wasn't being defended. It simply no longer existed here. By late afternoon, I realized I was no longer mapping coincidences. I was observing a system in motion. Each replacement wasn't isolated. It reinforced the next, creating a closed loop where contradiction couldn't survive. Standing on a quiet sidewalk, watching children I didn't recognize play under the supervision of parents who shouldn't have existed, I felt the first genuine spike of fear, not of being discovered, but of being absorbed. If I stayed long enough, if I stopped questioning, I suspected Milbrook would find a place for me and erase the part of me that knew anything was wrong. That night, I sat in my car on a side street and tried to dismantle what I'd seen using reason alone. Stress could distort perception. Fatigue could create patterns where none existed. Cognitive bias was a familiar enemy. I'd testified about it in court more than once. I told myself I was projecting meaning onto coincidence, that I was letting the strangeness of the case bend my judgment. But rationalizations require gaps to hide in, and Milbrook offered none. I replayed every encounter in my head, searching for cracks, misremembered details, slips of language, anything to suggest uncertainty. There were none. Each person I spoke to inhabited their identity completely. Their confidence was seamless, not defensive. They weren't protecting a lie. They were living inside it. I reviewed the photographs I'd taken on my phone. Different locations, different times of day, different people. The same face stared back at me from every screen. When I overlaid images, the alignment was perfect down to the millimeter. No variation in bone structure, no asymmetry. Not even the subtle differences you expect between siblings. I tried one last explanation. Twins, a genetic anomaly, some bizarre, insular bloodline. But the ages didn't work. The family trees didn't work. The math refused to cooperate. At some point, I realized my thoughts had begun to circle the same conclusion from different angles, like an animal pacing a cage. The problem wasn't that I lacked information. It was that the information led somewhere I didn't want to follow. I shut off the engine and sat in the dark, listening to the distant sounds of Milbrook settling into sleep, doors closing, laughter fading, a town at peace with itself. That was when the fear finally set in. Not sharp, not panicked, but heavy and deliberate. The fear of understanding. Because once you accept that something impossible is happening, you also accept that the rules you rely on no longer apply. And if the rules were gone, then so was the protection they offered. I wrote one sentence in my notebook before closing it for the night. If this continues, I will have to stop explaining Milbrook and start surviving it. Milbrook Elementary sat a few blocks from the square, a low brick building decorated with hand-painted murals of smiling children and cartoon animals. The parking lot was full. Morning drop-off was in progress, parents lingering by car doors, teachers waving students inside. It looked exactly like it should, which somehow made my unease sharper. Inside. The principal greeted me warmly and led me down the hallway. As he spoke, I focused on his face, still carrying the residual tension from the previous day. Something about him felt familiar, though I couldn't immediately place why. His smile lingered a second too long, the corners of his mouth lifting in a way I'd seen before. We stopped outside a classroom. A teacher stepped out to introduce herself. The sensation hit me then. Subtle. Almost dismissible. Her eyes, the shape of them, the distance between them. I felt a faint pressure behind my temples, like the beginning of a headache. A janitor passed us pushing a cart. He nodded politely. Same eyes, same jawline. The school nurse waved from the end of the hall. Same face again. I stood there, suddenly aware of my own breathing. Different heights, different ages, different genders. But the structure beneath it all, the geometry, was identical. It wasn't resemblance, it was replication. I asked the principal a few routine questions, forcing my voice to stay even. He answered easily, unaware that anything was wrong. As we walked, students filed past us. I watched their faces closely now, my pulse quickening with each step. Every child carried echoes of the same features, softened by youth, but unmistakable. The same blueprint, scaled down. When we reached the exit, I caught my reflection in the glass door, and behind it, the principal's face hovering near my shoulder. For a split second, my brain tried to align his features with every other face I'd seen that day. They fit perfectly. I stepped outside into the sunlight, my hands trembling despite myself. This wasn't stress. This wasn't pattern-seeking. This was repetition, and I had only just begun to notice how deep it went once I allowed myself to see it. I couldn't stop. The realization followed me out of the school and into the street like a shadow I couldn't shake. I slowed my walk, pretending to check my phone, and began watching faces with intent instead of habit. The mail carrier crossing the street had the same narrow chin. The woman locking her bike outside the library shared the same brow ridge. Even the teenager leaning against a lamppost, earbuds in, carried a softened version of the same proportions. They moved differently, held themselves differently. Age, posture, weight, and expression disguised the truth at a glance. But underneath it all was the same structure. One face, stretched and compressed across dozens of bodies. It was as if someone had designed a single model and then run it through endless variations, adjusting surface details, but never touching the core. I passed a storefront window and caught my reflection layered over the faces behind me. For a fleeting, irrational moment, I expected my own features to have changed, to find myself wearing that same geometry. The thought made my stomach clench. I forced myself to engage. I asked a woman for directions. I made small talk with a man waiting for a crosswalk signal. Up close, the illusion became undeniable. Skin tone varied. Wrinkles formed in different places. Hairlines receded or thickened. But the skull beneath was constant, measured, precise. This wasn't coincidence or shared ancestry. The statistical odds collapsed under their own weight. Even identical twins diverge in small ways. These people hadn't. What unsettled me most was the lack of reaction when I looked too long. No discomfort, no challenge. They met my gaze with the same open normalcy as before. I was the only one aware that something fundamental was wrong. As I circled the square, I counted faces without meaning to. 20, 30, 40, all the same. By the time I returned to my car, my hands were shaking. The town hadn't just replaced a few families. It had standardized itself. Individuality existed only on the surface, a cosmetic layer applied over a single underlying form. Milbrook wasn't populated. It was replicated. I didn't want the confirmation, but it came anyway. I was walking back toward the sheriff's office when I felt it. that subtle tightening in my chest that comes when your instincts have already reached a conclusion your mind is still resisting. I told myself I was done observing, that I had enough for the day. But my eyes kept lifting on their own, drawn to faces like magnets finding metal. Sheriff Collins stepped out of the building just as I reached the curb. He raised a hand in greeting. His posture relaxed. Familiar. For a moment, my brain supplied the version of him I expected to see, the distinct face of a man I'd already met. Then the overlay snapped into place. The same structure, the same measurements, the same face. Seeing it on him collapsed the last barrier in my head. This wasn't limited to civilians. It wasn't confined to certain families or professions. Authority hadn't been spared. The pattern didn't stop anywhere because it didn't need to. Collins spoke, asking if I'd found what I was looking for. I barely heard the words. I was watching the way his expressions moved, the way they matched every other face I'd studied, just wearing a different tone. Calm, assured, sheriff-shaped. I answered automatically and excused myself, afraid that if I stayed any longer, I'd say something I couldn't take back. As I walked away, I felt exposed, like the town could sense that I'd crossed some internal threshold. Back in my car, I closed the door and sat in silence. The realization settled slowly, heavily, like sediment sinking in water. Milbrook wasn't a town full of people who looked alike. It was a town made of one person, copied, adjusted, distributed across roles and generations to simulate variety. The missing families weren't anomalies. They were variables that had been removed. I pressed my forehead against the steering wheel and exhaled, my reflection staring back from the darkened glass. Whatever Milbrook was, it wasn't hiding anymore. I had simply reached the point where it no longer needed to. I didn't sleep that night. I lay on the motel bed, fully clothed, the curtains half open, watching the orange glow of the parking lot light smear itself across the ceiling. Every time I closed my eyes, faces surfaced, dozens of them, layered over one another until they blurred into a single, impossible image. At some point before dawn, I gave up pretending rest was possible and sat at the small desk by the window. I spread everything out, my notebook, printed reports, my phone, a portable hard drive. I started with the photographs I'd taken around town, uploading them one by one, different locations, different lighting, different people. I told myself to slow down, to approach this like any other anomaly. But my hands moved with a nervous precision I couldn't suppress. I began measuring. Distance between pupils, width of the jaw, angle of the cheekbones. I used 3 different software tools, each calibrated separately. The results came back identical every time. Not similar, identical. The same ratios carried across men, women, teenagers, the elderly, even allowing for distortion and perspective. The margins of error collapsed to 0. I overlaid images manually, adjusting opacity until one face dissolved into another. They aligned perfectly, as if one photograph had simply been duplicated and resized. No asymmetry, no drift, no natural variation. I stared at the screen until my eyes burned. By 4 p.m., the room felt smaller, the air heavier. I realized I was holding my breath while waiting for each analysis to fail. It never did. This wasn't pareidolia. It wasn't stress. It wasn't exhaustion inventing patterns in noise. What I was looking at violated everything I knew about biology, probability, and identity. As the sky outside began to lighten, I leaned back in the chair, suddenly aware of how quiet the motel had become. No cars, no voices, just the soft hum of electronics and the weight of a conclusion I hadn't consciously allowed myself to state. Milbrook wasn't strange because people were missing. It was strange because they weren't. Something had gone to extraordinary lengths to make sure every absence was filled, and it had done so with terrifying precision. By mid-morning, denial was no longer an option, but I still needed something external, something cold and mechanical, to tell me I wasn't losing my grip. Human perception can fail. Algorithms don't panic. They don't imagine. They only calculate. I logged into the Bureau's facial recognition system using a secure line and uploaded a controlled sample set. I chose images taken days apart, under different lighting conditions, at different distances. I labeled them carefully, assigning each face a separate identity as the system required. Part of me still expected it to flag similarities, maybe siblings, maybe a shared regional profile. Instead, the system froze. After a few seconds, an error message appeared, followed by an automated diagnostic report. The software could not distinguish between subjects. It returned a single match confidence score, 100%, for every comparison. According to the system, every face belonged to the same individual. I reran the test with stricter parameters. Same result. I adjusted for age progression. Same result. I removed half the data and tested again. Same result. The software wasn't confused. It was certain. I sat back and felt a cold wash of clarity move through me. This wasn't a flaw in the program. Facial recognition systems are trained on millions of variations. Twins, burn victims, surgical alterations. They expect difference. They're designed to find it. Milbrook had none. I cross-checked with a secondary system used for counter-terrorism screening. It flagged the entire sample set as a single person attempting to assume multiple identities simultaneously. In any other context, that result would have triggered an immediate national security alert. Here, it simply confirmed the impossible. I closed the laptop and stared at my reflection in the dark screen, half expecting the face looking back at me to shift, to realign itself into something familiar, but wrong. It didn't. Not yet. Technology hadn't explained Milbrook. It had stripped away the last excuse I had left. Whatever was happening there wasn't metaphorical. It wasn't psychological. It was physical, measurable, repeatable. And it meant that somewhere, past the limits of oversight and ethics, someone had figured out how to copy a human being perfectly. Over and over again. I called Dr. Patricia Vance because I needed someone whose job was to tell me no. Vance had spent her career explaining why patterns that felt meaningful were often accidents of perception. She was cautious, precise, and deeply skeptical of extraordinary claims. If anyone could dismantle Milbrook, it would be her. I didn't tell her my conclusions. I only sent the data. An hour later, she called me back. There was a pause at the beginning of the call that lasted just long enough to feel wrong. When she spoke, her voice carried the careful calm of someone choosing each word with deliberate restraint. "Sarah," she said, "walk me through how these samples were collected." I did. Locations, times, distances, controls. I described the facial measurements, the software outputs, the cross-system verification. She interrupted once, asking if I'd checked for data contamination. I had. Twice. When I finished, the line went quiet again. "What you're describing," she said slowly, "cannot occur naturally." I waited for the qualification, the alternative explanation. It never came. She told me identical twins diverge in measurable ways before birth. Even clones, hypothetical, experimental clones, would accumulate differences through development, environment, microtrauma. Perfect facial congruence across unrelated individuals violated basic genetic entropy. "It's not just unlikely," she said. "It breaks the model. Biology doesn't allow this level of uniformity." I asked if stress could be influencing my interpretation. "If this were subjective," she replied, We wouldn't be having this conversation. Your data isn't interpretive. It's absolute. That was when I felt something inside me give way. Not panic. Not relief. But a quiet internal collapse. I had been hoping she'd argue with me. Instead, she sounded unsettled, and that unsettled me more than confirmation ever could. Before hanging up, she added one last thing, almost as an afterthought. If these people are genetically identical, she said, then someone has intervened in a way that's far beyond unauthorized research. This would require intent, infrastructure, continuity. After the call ended, I sat alone in the motel room, listening to the distant sounds of Milbrook waking up, cars starting, doors opening, normal life resuming. Expert denial had failed. Not because the experts were wrong, but because reality had moved somewhere they could no longer follow. The deeper I went into Milbrook's records, the more the past began to loop back on itself. I requested access to the county archive under the pretense of routine verification, and no one questioned it. The clerk smiled, handed me a visitor badge, and led me into a room filled with filing cabinets and microfilm readers that smelled faintly of dust and ozone. I started with school records, enrollment lists, yearbooks, graduation programs. At first glance, everything looked normal, names changing year to year, students aging out, new ones appearing. But when I began pulling the photographs, the pattern surfaced again. The same face stared back at me from every decade. A boy in the 1970s yearbook carried the same bone structure as a teenager in the 1990s. The same jawline as a middle-aged parent in the 2010s. Hairstyles shifted. Glasses appeared and disappeared. But the underlying geometry never changed. It was like watching the same person reincarnated over and over, each time given a new name and a slightly altered life. I checked employment records next, fire department rosters, city council photos, church directories. The repetition followed me there too. Different titles, different signatures, identical faces. Even the handwriting on official forms showed similarities, pressure patterns, looping strokes, variations of the same hand, pretending to be many. What made it worse was the consistency. There were no outliers, no failed copies, no corrupted versions. The repetition was flawless, stretching backward for decades without degradation. I realized then that this wasn't a recent intervention. Milbrook hadn't been altered. It had been maintained. Each generation wasn't replacing the last. They were overlapping, layered carefully to preserve the illusion of time passing. History wasn't recorded here. It was curated. As I returned the files and thanked the clerk, she asked if I'd found what I was looking for. I told her yes, because it felt safer than saying no. Outside, the town looked unchanged, unaware that its own history had begun folding in on itself in my hands. Milbrook didn't just repeat faces. It repeated lives. I thought I was prepared by the time I requested the coroner's records. I wasn't. Milbrook's death certificates were filed neatly, chronologically, each one stamped and signed with bureaucratic indifference. I began with recent cases, heart failure, accidents, natural causes, and worked backward. The names changed. The causes varied. The faces did not. Autopsy photographs confirmed what the yearbooks had suggested. Skull measurements matched across decades with impossible precision. Cranial width, orbital depth, mandibular angle. I laid transparent overlays across the images, expecting at least minor deviation. There was none. Every skull aligned perfectly, as if traced from the same original. Dental records were worse. Teeth wear patterns differed slightly, consistent with age and diet. But the structure beneath, the spacing, root angles, enamel thickness, was identical. Dentistry relies on uniqueness. It's why bodies can be identified long after everything else is gone. Here, death had failed to introduce variation. According to the files, the same man, biologically speaking, had died 7 times, buried under 7 different names, mourned by 7 different families. Each death absorbed cleanly into the town's rhythm, leaving no residue of suspicion behind. I searched for anomalies, twin burials, shared graves, anything to suggest error or fraud. There was nothing. Each body had been processed, documented, and interred according to protocol. The system had accepted them without resistance. That was when the implication settled in fully. Death wasn't an endpoint here. It was a maintenance function. When one version failed, another had already taken its place. Loss was allowed only insofar as it didn't disrupt continuity. Milbrook could afford death because it had redundancy. I closed the final file and sat back, my pulse pounding in my ears. The horror wasn't that these people died. It was that death meant nothing. In Milbrook, even mortality had been standardized, and the same person kept dying, so the illusion could continue living. By the time I finished reconciling population data, the pattern had become suffocating in its precision. Birth records, death certificates, census updates, everything balanced. Not approximately. Exactly. Milbrook's population number never drifted more than a single digit before correcting itself. In a town this size, that shouldn't have been possible. Chance alone should have introduced noise. It hadn't. Every birth coincided neatly with a death elsewhere in the records, as if the town obeyed a conservation law. No surges, no declines, no unexplained gaps. Children appeared when space existed for them. Elderly residents passed away when redundancy allowed it. The numbers didn't just describe Milbrook, they governed it. I traced utility usage next: water, electricity, waste management. The curves were smooth, predictable, almost elegant. No spikes during holidays, no dips during storms. Consumption patterns suggested a population that behaved not as individuals, but as a regulated unit, a system. Driver's license records finally broke what little distance I'd managed to maintain. Hundreds of licenses, issued over decades, all bore the same photograph. Not similar. The same image reused endlessly, lightly retouched, aged or softened just enough to pass cursory inspection. The state database hadn't flagged it because no one had told it to look for impossibility. Milbrook didn't require external correction because it produced none of the errors that trigger oversight. It recycled identity, memory, and even death internally, like a machine designed to sustain itself indefinitely. That was the moment I understood why the missing families had vanished so cleanly. They weren't removed violently. They were extraneous. Closed systems don't tolerate disruption. Anything that introduces uncertainty, questions, deviation, excess, must be eliminated or converted. Milbrook didn't panic when something didn't fit. It adjusted. I stared at the final spreadsheet until the numbers blurred, aware that I was looking at something far older and far more deliberate than a single experiment gone wrong. Milbrook wasn't hiding from the outside world. It was sealed off from it, and I was standing at the edge of something that had been closed, perfected, and repeating itself for decades, waiting to see whether I would become part of the balance, or the next variable to be removed. By the time I requested the mobile unit, I had already crossed a line I couldn't uncross. There was no protocol for a town like Milbrook. No checkbox for entire population appears to be the same person. So I did what agents have always done when reality outpaces procedure. I invented a reason that sounded reasonable. A routine federal health survey. Voluntary. Anonymous. framed as part of a nationwide study on rural wellness. The request sailed through faster than it should have. No pushback, no questions. It was approved with the same quiet efficiency I'd seen in Milbrook's own records, as if the system itself was eager to cooperate. The unit arrived 2 days later, a white trailer parked near the community center. Banners went up. Flyers appeared in shop windows overnight. I hadn't authorized half of them. Someone had taken initiative. And people came. They lined up calmly, patiently, chatting with neighbors while they waited to provide saliva samples. No suspicion, no anxiety. Parents brought their children. Elderly couples held hands. Nearly 200 residents volunteered in a single afternoon. What struck me most wasn't the number. It was the compliance. No one asked why the survey was happening now. No one declined. Participation felt less like a choice and more like a reflex, as if the town recognized the request as something it was meant to fulfill. I watched each person enter the trailer, watched the same face step inside again and again, wearing different clothes, different expressions, different lives. Each sample was sealed, labeled, logged, different names, same origin. At one point, a woman smiled at me and thanked me for looking out for the community. The phrase landed wrong, too aligned, too complete. As the sun dipped low and the line finally thinned, I felt a tightening in my chest, not anticipation, but dread. I already knew what the results would say. This wasn't about discovery anymore. It was about confirmation. When the trailer doors closed and the last sample was secured, I realized I had just asked Milbrook to prove something it had been hiding in plain sight. And it had answered without hesitation. The call came 7 days later. At 2:14 a.m., the hour when explanations feel thinner and truths hit harder. I recognized the number immediately, Dr. Elizabeth Kane's direct line. She never called field agents unless something had gone catastrophically wrong. She didn't say hello. "Sarah," she said, and paused. I could hear papers shifting on her end, the soft hum of equipment. I reran the analysis 3 times, independently, different technicians, different machines. I sat up on the motel bed, already bracing for impact. And all 200 samples are genetically identical. The words landed cleanly, without drama, which somehow made them worse. Not siblings, she explained. Not twins. Not a closed bloodline. The DNA profiles matched down to non-coding regions, areas where even clones, theoretical clones, should show divergence over time. There was no genetic noise, no drift, no mutation accumulation consistent with age or environment. "They're the same individual," she said, "copied perfectly." I asked if contamination was possible. She answered before I finished the question. Controls were clean. Chain of custody intact. External verification already completed. Then her voice dropped, professional restraint giving way to something closer to disbelief. "To produce a population like this," she continued, "you'd need sustained cloning over decades, developmental acceleration, memory implantation, or conditioning to account for age variance and identity differentiation. This isn't a one-off experiment. It's infrastructure." I stared at the wall, noticing a hairline crack I hadn't seen before, wondering how long it had been there, wondering how much I'd missed by not looking closely enough. "This technology isn't supposed to exist," she said. "Not at this scale, not this refined." I asked her who else knew. "Just us," she replied, "for now." When the call ended, the room felt unnaturally still, as if the air itself had absorbed the weight of what I'd learned. Denial had been my last defense. Thin, fragile, but necessary. It was gone now. Milbrook wasn't an anomaly. It was proof, and somewhere beyond that quiet town, Someone had decided that a single human being was enough to populate an entire world. I spent the rest of the night staring at the ceiling, replaying Dr. Kane's words until they lost their shape and became weight. Infrastructure, sustained cloning, memory implantation. Each term implied not just a breakthrough, but a decision, a long chain of them, made by people who knew exactly what they were building and chose to keep going anyway. By morning, I started mapping what would be required. Facilities capable of large-scale cloning, hidden well enough to avoid oversight for decades. Controlled gestation, accelerated growth to produce adults on demand. Neurological conditioning precise enough to install entire life histories without collapse. None of it was speculative. Each piece existed in fragments across classified research, restricted programs, black budgets. Someone had assembled them into a working whole. That was the part that chilled me most. Milbrook wasn't the result of reckless experimentation. It was careful, iterative, improved over time. The absence of failed copies, the lack of genetic drift, the seamless social integration, all signs of a mature system. I thought about the children I'd seen at the school, the elderly residents who believed they'd lived full, ordinary lives, if their memories had been installed. Then their suffering and joy were real, even if their origins weren't. That blurred the ethical line in a way I wasn't prepared for. Technology like this doesn't remain isolated by accident. It's protected, justified, buried under layers of classification and rationalization. The fact that Milbrook had operated for decades meant it wasn't just tolerated, it was valued. I realized then that I was no longer investigating a crime. I was standing at the edge of a capability the world wasn't supposed to have, one that redefined what a person could be reduced to and reproduced from. Milbrook wasn't an outlier. It was a proof of concept, and proof, once it exists, invites replication. The question that haunted me as the sun rose over that impossibly quiet town wasn't whether this technology should exist. It was how many times it had already been used, and how many other towns like Milbrook were still out there, living perfect lives built on something that should never have been possible. The case stopped being mine the moment I submitted my preliminary findings. Within hours, my access permissions changed. Files I'd opened the day before now returned denial notices. My phone stopped ringing, not because people were busy, but because they'd been told not to call. That silence was the first confirmation that I'd stepped into something far above my clearance. I was flown to a secure facility outside D.C. under an itinerary that didn't exist. No badges, no names on doors, just a conference room with no windows and a table already occupied by people who didn't introduce themselves. Their uniforms didn't match. Their agencies overlapped in ways that made my stomach tighten. They didn't ask me what I thought was happening. They told me. The briefing began with a single slide. Project Milbrook. No seal, no dates. Just a designation that had been active longer than I'd been alive. As the presentation unfolded, the town I thought I was uncovering was reframed, not as an anomaly, but as a successful iteration. Milbrook was one of 12 sites, established over 6 decades. Each community designed to appear ordinary, self-sustaining, and invisible. The residents weren't just cloned, they were constructed. Psychological architectures layered onto identical biological frames. Memory packages, behavioral parameters, emotional baselines calibrated to maintain stability. A man I later learned was Dr. Marcus Webb explained it clinically. Genetic uniformity removes noise, he said. What remains is behavior, choice, influence. The missing families were addressed without ceremony. Researchers embedded long-term, removed when they compromised containment, their identities reassigned to maintain continuity. No one at the table flinched when this was said. I asked how the residents could be considered human under those conditions. There was a pause, just long enough to feel intentional. Because they believe they are. Someone answered. When the briefing ended, I was handed a document and told to sign. Lifetime non-disclosure. Criminal penalties spelled out in careful detail. The implication was clear. This wasn't a secret I was being trusted with. It was a truth I was being buried under. As I left the room, escorted back into anonymity, I understood something with brutal clarity. Milbrook hadn't been hidden from me. It had been waiting for me to see it, so it could decide what to do with me next. They spoke about the residents the way engineers talk about systems, not people. Slides shifted on the screen, each one reducing Milbrook to layers: biology, psychology, sociology, stacked neatly on top of one another. The clones were only the foundation. What mattered was what had been built on them. Dr. Webb explained that every resident was assigned a role before activation. Sheriff, teacher, parent, shop owner. The town wasn't allowed to develop organically. It was curated. Each personality was calibrated to complement the others, minimizing conflict while still allowing enough friction to produce useful data. Too much harmony led to stagnation. Too much dissent led to collapse. Memories weren't copied from real lives. They were written. Childhoods designed to produce specific attachment styles. Traumas inserted at controlled levels to test resilience. Even preferences, food, music, hobbies, were adjusted to create predictable overlap and divergence. The illusion of individuality wasn't a side effect. It was the product. A question formed in my mind before I could stop it. "Do they know?" I asked. "No," Webb replied. "Self-awareness destabilizes the construct." He showed charts tracking emotional health, productivity, relationship longevity. According to the data, Milbrook outperformed natural populations in nearly every category. Divorce rates were lower. Violent crime was nearly non-existent. Community engagement was high. "They're happy," someone said, as if that settled it. I thought about the faces I'd seen at the school, the pride in the shop owners' voices, the way parents watched their children play. If those emotions were programmed, did that make them less real or more dangerous? The answer, I realized, was neither. It made them controllable. Designed humans don't question the shape of the world they're built to inhabit. They reinforce it simply by living inside it. Milbrook wasn't a prison because no one inside it was trying to leave. As the briefing continued, I understood the true purpose of the project. It wasn't cloning. It wasn't control. It was optimization. And once you prove people can be designed to fit a system perfectly, the next logical step isn't to shut the system down. It's to scale it. I asked about the families because I needed to hear it said plainly. The Johnsons, the Williamses, the Hartmans. 15 people don't vanish without leaving a shape behind. And I wanted to know what shape the truth took in a room where ethics had already been negotiated away. Dr. Webb didn't hesitate. He didn't lower his voice. They weren't residents, he said. They were assets. Embedded researchers, placed into Milbrook years earlier to monitor long-term stability. They lived inside the system, raised children who weren't biologically theirs, participated in town life while quietly reporting deviations upward. According to the files, they had done their jobs well, too well. They started to notice inconsistencies. Webb continued. Patterns we didn't want observed from the inside. The room remained calm as he explained how containment worked. When a researcher became a liability, they were removed during a scheduled transition window. No violence, No public disruption. Their exit was logged as a clerical error, a reassignment, a correction. Their lives didn't end. They were overwritten. The identities were reassigned to existing residents, clones already in circulation, whose memory sets were updated to absorb the missing histories. Children were reassigned parents. Neighbors were reassigned friendships. The town adjusted in less than 48 hours. I asked what happened to the researchers themselves. A pause this time. Short. Deliberate. They were debriefed, someone said, and relocated. The word carried no detail. It didn't need to. I thought of the houses I'd visited, the family photos that almost made sense, the way grief had been erased so thoroughly it left no vacuum behind. Loss wasn't just managed here. It was engineered out of existence. That's why there were no signs of struggle, I said quietly. No aftermath. Yes, Webb replied. Aftermath creates instability. In that moment, I understood the most terrifying part of Project Milbrook. It wasn't that people could be copied. It wasn't even that lives could be fabricated. It was that human connection, marriage, parenthood, friendship had been reduced to modular components, transferable, replaceable, disposable. The missing families weren't anomalies. They were proof that no one inside Milbrook was irreplaceable, including me. The package arrived 5 years after I resigned, slipped through my mail slot without a return address or postage mark. I recognized. It was thin, unremarkable, the kind of envelope that could have held junk mail or an expired credit card offer. I almost threw it away without opening it. What stopped me was the weight, too heavy for paper alone. Inside was a black flash drive, unbranded, wrapped once in plain printer paper. No note, no explanation. Just 6 words written in block letters across the fold. You were right. It's failing. I didn't plug it in right away. Old habits die hard. I powered up a clean laptop, isolated from any network, and waited longer than necessary before inserting the drive, half expecting something to trigger simply because I was watching for it. Nothing happened. A single folder appeared on the screen, time-stamped less than 48 hours earlier. The footage inside was raw security video. Fixed angles, no audio. Milbrook locations I recognized instantly. The sheriff's office, the hardware store, the high school hallway after hours. At first, everything looked normal. People moved through their routines, familiar faces passing in and out of frame. Then I saw it. Sheriff Collins stood alone in his office, staring into the small mirror mounted inside his locker. He leaned closer, head tilted, as if examining a flaw that wouldn't resolve. His hand rose, hesitated, then touched his own face with cautious disbelief. He stepped back abruptly, shaking his head, and for a brief moment his expression collapsed into something raw and unprogrammed. Another clip showed 2 men sitting across from each other after closing time at the diner. They spoke animatedly, then slowly went still. Their mouths stopped moving. Both looked confused. One pointed to his chest. The other mirrored the gesture, then laughed nervously, the soundless motion sharp enough to feel even without audio. I watched until my eyes burned. The system wasn't breaking violently. It was unraveling quietly, from the inside. Memories overlapping, identities bleeding together, the illusion losing coherence. When the final clip ended, the laptop fan hummed softly in the dark room. I realized my hands were shaking, not from fear, but from recognition. Project Milbrook hadn't accounted for one variable: time. And now, after decades of perfection, the town was beginning to remember something it was never supposed to know. I didn't announce my return to Milbrook. I rented a car under a different name, paid cash for gas, and arrived just before sunset, when the town used to feel most alive. The welcome sign was still there, The slogan hadn't changed, but the effect was gone. The words felt thinner, like paint stretched over old cracks. Something was wrong immediately. People still moved through the streets, but without the old certainty. Conversations stalled mid-sentence. Smiles arrived a beat too late, as if someone had to remember to perform them. A man stood outside the hardware store, staring at the sign, head tilted, reading the name over and over like it might change if he concentrated hard enough. Inside the diner, the rhythm was off. Orders were repeated. A waitress hesitated before writing things down, then crossed out her own notes and started again. I heard fragments of conversation that didn't quite line up. Someone mentioning a childhood home that no longer existed. Someone else correcting them. Both falling silent afterward. The faces were the same, but the confidence that once animated them had drained away. It was like watching actors forget their lines in the middle of a long-running play. No panic yet, just confusion. Discomfort. A growing awareness that something underneath the surface wasn't holding anymore. I passed the elementary school and saw two parents arguing quietly near the fence. Not angry, disturbed. One of them gestured sharply, then stopped, pressing a hand to their forehead as if struck by a sudden headache. The other looked around nervously, lowering their voice, afraid of being overheard. That fear was new. Milbrook used to correct inconsistency automatically. Now, the inconsistencies were lingering, accumulating. People noticed them, even if they didn't yet understand what they meant. The system had relied on certainty to function, and certainty was eroding. As night fell, the town grew quieter than it should have. Porch lights flicked on later than usual. Doors closed early. I sat in my car near the square, watching shadows move behind curtains, and felt the unmistakable sense that Milbrook was no longer sealed. It was leaking. Whatever project Milbrook had built, it was coming undone not through rebellion or violence, but through doubt. The smallest crack imaginable. And cracks, once they appear, have a way of spreading. The collision happened in public, which is why it couldn't be corrected. I was standing across the street from the hardware store when the argument spilled out onto the sidewalk. Robert Thompson and David Peterson, two men who had never raised their voices in all the years I'd known Milbrook, were facing each other with the same expression of confusion sharpened into anger. Not rage, something worse. Recognition. "You remember the creek," Thompson said, his voice tight. "Behind the old mill. We used to skip stones there after school." Peterson shook his head hard. "That's not possible. That was my creek. I broke my wrist there. My dad yelled at me the whole way to the hospital." Thompson laughed, but there was no humor in it. "No, my dad did. I still remember the smell of his truck." They stopped at the same time. Both men went still, like they'd heard an echo where none should exist. Thompson's hand drifted unconsciously to his wrist. Peterson mirrored the motion a half-second later. I watched their faces change as the same memory landed in two places at once. People nearby pretended not to notice, but they were watching. Everyone was watching now. This wasn't a private inconsistency, easily smoothed over later. This was contradiction made visible. "That's not—" Peterson started, then faltered. He pressed his fingers against his temple. "Why do I remember your house?" Thompson stepped back, breathing hard. "Why do I remember your kids?" The silence around them thickened. A woman across the street covered her mouth. Someone dropped a bag of groceries and didn't bend to pick it up. I felt the weight of the moment settle. Heavy and irreversible. This was the failure point. Two identities had overlapped too completely. The boundaries that kept each version contained had dissolved. And the system had no answer for what happened next. There was no authority stepping in. No correction. Just two men staring at each other, realizing they were holding pieces of the same life. I understood then that the truth wouldn't arrive as a revelation. It would arrive as confusion that refused to go away. Once a person begins to recognize themselves in someone else, the illusion doesn't shatter all at once. It fractures, slowly, painfully, but permanently, as the crowd dispersed in uneasy silence. Thompson and Peterson remained where they were, no longer arguing, no longer certain who they were supposed to be. Milbrook had crossed a threshold. The town wasn't discovering the truth. It was remembering it. I told myself there would never be a right moment, so I stopped waiting for one. Sheriff Collins agreed to meet me after hours, uneasy but curious, the same way people are when they already know the answer and hope to be proven wrong. We sat in his office with the lights dimmed, the town quiet outside, Milbrook holding its breath. I started small. Patterns, inconsistencies, shared memories. He nodded along at first, relieved, as if this were something that could still be explained away with stress or rumor. Then I showed him the footage, his own reflection, his hand touching his face like it belonged to someone else. He didn't interrupt. When I told him about the cloning, about the genetic tests, about Project Milbrook, he went very still. Not disbelief, processing. The kind that happens when denial finally runs out of room. So none of this is real, he said quietly. It's real, I replied. It's just not original. That was when his composure cracked. Not violently, slowly. He asked about his parents, his childhood, his badge. Each question stripped another layer away. I answered honestly, even when the truth was cruel. By the time I finished, 3 hours had passed. Collins leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. They're going to figure it out anyway, he said. Aren't they? Yes. He exhaled once, steadying himself. Then we tell them. All of them. The town hall filled faster than I expected. Word travels differently in places like Milbrook, especially when fear is involved. I stood at the front of the room, the same faces staring back at me in 100 variations of the same expression. I told them everything. Not gently, not gradually, completely. You are genetically identical. You were created in laboratories. Your lives were designed. The room erupted, shouting, crying, denial. Some people laughed hysterically. Others went silent, eyes unfocused, as if their memories were rearranging themselves in real time. I raised my voice over the chaos and said the only thing that mattered. Your feelings are real. Your choices are real. What you do next is yours. In that moment, I wasn't sure if I'd saved them or destroyed them, but I knew I'd stopped lying. They came before the town had time to decide what it felt. 48 hours after the meeting, black SUVs appeared at the edges of Milbrook like punctuation marks at the end of a sentence. Roads were closed quietly. Cell signals dropped. Federal agents moved with the efficiency of people correcting a problem, not responding to a crisis. The town watched from behind curtains, already learning what truth cost. I was taken first. There was no arrest scene, no raised voices. 2 men in plain clothes met me outside the motel and asked me to come with them to answer a few questions. They already had the cuffs in their pockets. I noticed how carefully they avoided looking at the townspeople gathering across the street. The interrogation lasted hours, maybe days. Time blurred in windowless rooms where the same questions were asked with different phrasing, as if repetition might undo what I'd done. They cited statutes I hadn't heard spoken aloud since training. Espionage Act violations, unlawful disclosure, sedition by destabilization. Words designed to reframe conscience as crime. Was it worth it? One of them asked. I thought of the faces in the town hall. The fear. Yes, but also the relief. The way some people straightened when the lie finally collapsed, as if something heavy had been lifted. Yes, I said. Milbrook was placed under protective containment. That was the term they used. Counseling teams were flown in. Narrative control protocols activated. Officials debated whether the residents should be allowed to remember what they'd learned, or whether the damage could still be reversed. It was Sheriff Collins who ended that debate. He testified on my behalf, standing in a federal hearing room and telling them that ignorance hadn't protected his community. It had imprisoned it. She didn't take anything from us, he said. She gave us the ability to choose. I was sentenced to time served and probation, my career erased in a single signature. As they escorted me out, one official leaned close and said, almost kindly, "Some truths are too dangerous to survive." Outside, the air felt different, lighter, honest. Punishment had been delivered, but the lie hadn't survived me, and neither, I suspected, had Milbrook. I didn't return to Milbrook for a long time. Part of that was probation. Part of it was fear, not of what I'd see, but of what it would mean if the town had survived the truth. Lies collapse loudly. Truths linger. They force adaptation. When I finally went back, the change was unmistakable. The town wasn't healed. It was awake. Some people had left, not fled, chosen. They packed their belongings, said careful goodbyes, and stepped into a world that had never prepared for them. Others stayed, not out of denial, but resolve. They stopped pretending Milbrook was normal and began deciding what normal would mean now. The underground facility was no longer hidden. The entrance stood open, stripped of secrecy, converted piece by piece into a museum and research center. Not a monument to shame, but to record, to remember, to make sure nothing like it could ever exist unnoticed again. What struck me most was how the residents spoke about themselves. Not as victims, not as experiments, as people. They argued, they disagreed. They grieved the lives they thought they'd had and built new ones on top of the truth. Identity didn't collapse, it reorganized. Freed from the illusion of origin, they defined themselves by choice instead of design. Sheriff Collins no longer wore the title. He called himself a community coordinator now, a word that implied consent rather than authority. When he handed me a photograph at the annual Founders' Day celebration, the day the truth was revealed, everyone in it looked different. Same faces, new expressions, ownership. "You gave us the option to know," he told me. "That's all anyone can ask for." The debate spread beyond Milbrook. Ethics panels, courts, Congress, other towns were discovered. Some chose ignorance, others chose truth. For the first time, the choice mattered. I used to believe humanity was defined by origin, birth, lineage, biology. Milbrook taught me something else. Being human isn't about where you come from. It's about whether your life belongs to you. And for the first time since the project began, it finally did.